In a modest, weathered building on the outskirts of town, 15-year-old Eva lived with her younger brother Toby and a handful of other children at Rosefield Orphanage. The place was worn down, with peeling walls and cracked floors that seemed to echo loneliness. Rosefield was a place that was functional rather than loving, and Eva, who rarely felt like she belonged, had spent most of her childhood within its confines, her world limited to those fading walls and the small garden in the back. While she was fiercely protective of her brother, she kept to herself most of the time, hiding away in her art rather than joining the other children's rowdy games. Eva's talent for painting set her apart, although it was an interest that the orphanage's caretakers only saw as a harmless hobby. Her paintings were more than just recreation to her. They were her only true escape. Whenever she was alone, she would spend hours sketching or painting with whatever supplies she could find or earn as small gifts. The images she created often drew on fleeting memories, dreams of places she thought she had seen as a child, a grand house with marble floors and high, arched windows that poured sunlight into endless hallways. Though she didn't understand why, she painted these scenes in vivid detail, compelled by a sense of longing and familiarity. Sometimes, she thought she could almost hear whispers from the past, as if the brushstrokes themselves held secrets she couldn't quite grasp. While Eva's world was internal and mysterious, Toby, her 10-year-old brother, was an anchor that kept her grounded. Toby had a delicate frame and pale skin, often battling colds and fevers that lingered longer than they should. Eva felt a constant, gnawing worry about him. He was all she had left that felt like family. And his health was fragile, a weight she carried silently. Because of his frequent illnesses, Toby stayed close to Eva, trailing after her when he was able, though he didn't share her talent for painting. Still, he admired her work, often sitting beside her as she painted, his weak but affectionate smile encouraging her. Life in Rosefield was a routine of chores and basic schooling, interrupted by rare outings or a few visitors interested in adoption, though no one had ever chosen Eva and Toby. While other children entertained dreams of new families, Eva, rooted by the faint memories in her paintings, held on to the idea that she and Toby came from somewhere special, even if she had no proof. Eva's recurring dreams and the images she painted were all she had to suggest that her life could be different. She didn't know why she kept painting the same scenes, but she felt they held a connection to the past that she was desperate to understand. In a place that constantly reminded her of what she didn't have, those fleeting images of a grand house felt like a lifeline. They whispered of a past that was beautiful and safe, a world she was determined to remember, even if it seemed more like fantasy than reality. It started with a cough, soft at first, barely more than a clearing of Toby's throat. Eva didn't think much of it, as Toby had always been prone to small illnesses, his frame fragile and his health often unsteady. But over the next few days, the cough grew worse, turning into a hacking sound that left him breathless. His skin turned a pale shade, his cheeks sallow, and his usual faint smile faded into a look of constant discomfort. Eva's worry intensified each day, watching helplessly as Toby's condition worsened. The orphanage's head caretaker, Mrs. Hafford, finally took notice when Toby's fever spiked, his small body shivering under the thin blankets that did little to keep out the winter chill. Mrs. Hafford was kind but blunt, and her face fell as she took in Toby's worsening condition. "I'll do what I can for him, but we don't have funds for a doctor," she said, her tone filled with quiet resignation. "We'll need to hope he improves with rest." Hope alone wasn't enough for Eva. She couldn't stand the thought of just waiting and watching Toby's health deteriorate without doing anything to help him. The fear gnawed at her, pressing harder than ever before. For a few days, she tried to think of any way to raise enough money for a doctor or medicine, her desperation growing with each passing hour as she watched her brother's health decline. One cold afternoon, as she was packing away her paints and brushes after finishing a painting session, an idea struck her. She had heard about the upcoming local art fair, a small event in the town square where artists and craftspeople sold their work to the townspeople and occasional tourists. Eva's hands hovered over her latest painting, an image of the grand house she often saw in her dreams, a painting that seemed to carry fragments of her past. Perhaps, she thought, her paintings could be more than just an escape. Maybe they could help Toby. The decision wasn't easy. Eva felt an unexpected pang at the thought of parting with her work. Her paintings were pieces of her, expressions of the past she barely remembered. Each brushstroke held her own quiet longing and her memories, faint as they were. But now, with Toby's health hanging by a thread, those paintings held an even greater purpose. She knew that, if she wanted to help him, she would have to let go. That night, she gathered the handful of completed paintings she'd hidden away under her bed and wrapped them carefully, as if each one were a fragile relic. Eva stayed up late, framing each piece with makeshift borders, doing her best to make them presentable. For Toby's sake, she was willing to part with them all, hoping that someone at the fair would see something valuable in her work. As she lay down to sleep, the decision felt right. Her paintings had always been her connection to something larger, but now they had the power to make a difference. For the first time, they were more than memories. They were her chance to protect the only family she had left. The art fair bustled with life as townspeople and visitors strolled through the aisles, pausing to admire the paintings, handcrafted jewelry, and various other creations on display. The air was filled with the warm scent of roasted chestnuts from a nearby stall and the sound of a street musician playing a lively tune on his accordion. Eva's heart pounded as she set up her small display on the edge of the fairgrounds. Feeling strangely exposed, she had arranged her paintings with care, though she was acutely aware of how modest her setup looked compared to the polished booths around her. Toby, still weak but insistent on accompanying her, sat on a small stool beside her, wrapped in a coat several sizes too big. His face was pale, but he smiled up at Eva, his eyes glimmering with pride. Eva tried to smile back, though anxiety tugged at her as people glanced at her paintings, but moved on without stopping. Each step away felt like a rejection, and she began to wonder if this was a mistake. Then, as the sun began to sink, casting the fair in a warm golden light, an elderly woman with an air of quiet elegance stopped in front of Eva's paintings. She wore a deep green coat that stood out in the crowd, her silver hair pinned neatly back, and a pair of discerning eyes that seemed to take in every detail. She paused, staring at one of Eva's paintings, a piece depicting a large house surrounded by willows and wildflowers under a hazy sky. Eva noticed the woman's gaze linger, her expression growing more intent. After a long moment, the woman spoke, her voice low and gentle, though with an edge of something deeper. "This is remarkable, unusually vivid for someone so young. Tell me, did you paint all these yourself?" Eva nodded, feeling a strange mixture of pride and nervousness. "Yes, I did. They're based on memories, I think," she admitted, her voice wavering slightly. The woman's eyes softened, though her curiosity seemed to deepen. She leaned closer, examining the brushwork with a critical but appreciative eye. "Memories, you say? Do you remember where this place is?" Eva hesitated, glancing at Toby before replying. "No, I don't. It's just something I see in my dreams sometimes." The woman's lips pressed into a thoughtful line. "Interesting. Dreams can sometimes tell us more about ourselves than we realize," she murmured. She extended a hand gracefully. "My name is Mrs. Caldwell. I used to teach art once upon a time. And you are?" "I'm Eva," she said, shaking the woman's hand, feeling the firmness of Mrs. Caldwell's grip despite her age. "And this is my brother, Toby." Mrs. Caldwell turned her warm gaze to Toby, who offered her a small, tired smile. "A pleasure to meet you both. Eva, you have a rare gift. I can see traces of a very specific style in your work, a style I haven't encountered in years." Eva's curiosity was piqued. "You mean you've seen paintings like mine before?" "Yes," Mrs. Caldwell replied, her voice quiet but weighted with meaning. "Your style reminds me of someone I knew very well, a brilliant artist who passed away long ago. But before that, he was my dear friend. I can see traces of his influence in your brushstrokes, even if you're not aware of it yourself." Eva felt a shiver run through her. Could this woman somehow know her family, the past that had always felt more like a ghost in her life than something tangible? Do you think you might know where my family is from?" she asked, the hope in her voice barely masked. Mrs. Caldwell nodded slowly, her gaze growing softer. "I may know something of your past, yes, but there is much I don't know either. I would like to help you, Eva, if you'll let me." Eva glanced at Toby, who gave her an encouraging nod. This felt surreal, almost as if it were unfolding in a dream, but something inside her urged her to trust this woman. I would be grateful for any help you could offer." Mrs. Caldwell's eyes sparkled with something akin to relief. "Then come to my home sometime, both of you. I have a studio, and perhaps I can help you develop your skills further. Art like yours deserves guidance and care, Eva." Eva's heart skipped a beat, overwhelmed by the invitation and the potential answers Mrs. Caldwell might hold. She glanced down at her paintings, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of her canvas. She had always painted alone, with no one to teach her, no one who even understood her art. And now here was a woman who recognized something in her work, something that Eva herself had never known how to describe. "We would like that, Mrs. Caldwell," she replied, glancing at Toby for reassurance. His small smile told her that he, too, felt a sense of hope for the first time in a long while. Mrs. Caldwell bought 2 of Eva's paintings, selecting them with a careful eye. She held one up, her gaze lingering on the house Eva had painted so many times in her dreams. "Thank you for this, Eva. I have a feeling this is only the beginning." As Mrs. Caldwell walked away with her new paintings, Eva felt a thrill that mingled with a sense of quiet resolve. She had a chance to learn not only about her talent, but perhaps also about the past she had longed to understand. For Toby's sake, for her own, and for the family they had lost, she was ready to uncover the truth. The first visit to Mrs. Caldwell's home was unlike anything Eva and Toby had ever experienced. They arrived one chilly afternoon, walking up a path that wound through a garden filled with twisting ivy and old rose bushes. Mrs. Caldwell's house was a quaint stone cottage with high ceilings and large, arching windows that filled each room with soft, natural light. It was a world away from the cold walls of Rosefield Orphanage, and Eva couldn't help but feel both nervous and excited as Mrs. Caldwell welcomed them inside. Mrs. Caldwell led them through the house and into her studio, a room brimming with supplies, shelves filled with paint jars, brushes of every size, canvases both blank and completed leaning against the walls. In the center of the room stood a large easel, surrounded by a faint smell of oils and turpentine. Light streamed in from the wide windows, casting a warm glow over the workspace. Eva felt a sense of awe. She had never seen anything like it. The studio felt like a place of pure creation, a sanctuary for someone with a soul for art. "Welcome to my studio, Eva," Mrs. Caldwell said, her voice soft and inviting. "This is where I spent many years teaching, painting, and discovering new artists. And now I'd like it to be a place for you to do the same." Eva couldn't hide her wonder as she gazed around the room, but her curiosity spiked when her gaze settled on a painting in the corner of the room, a landscape of tall, ancient trees surrounding a grand house under a pale sky. It was eerily similar to the scenes she painted, the ones that seemed to haunt her dreams. Mrs. Caldwell noticed Eva's lingering stare. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Mrs. Caldwell said. "That's one of the last paintings done by your father, Thomas Green." Eva's heart skipped a beat. She could barely believe her ears. You knew my father?" Mrs. Caldwell nodded, her gaze warm but filled with a quiet sadness. "I did. Thomas was a remarkable painter, a dear friend and one of the most gifted artists I've ever had the pleasure to know. He had a talent much like yours, Eva, able to capture emotion and memory in his work. He was always restless, always seeking something deeper, something beyond mere technique. His art, it was personal, profound." Eva felt a surge of emotions, pride, curiosity, and a sharp pang of longing. She had never known anyone who could tell her about her father, who could explain where her talent came from, or why these images filled her dreams. But now, standing in Mrs. Caldwell's studio, she felt the veil lifting, as if a part of her life she thought was lost forever was slowly coming into focus. Mrs. Caldwell moved to a nearby shelf, pulling down a set of paints that looked slightly worn but well kept. "Ava, I want you to try something new today," she said, handing the paints to her. "Your father experimented endlessly with color, often using shades and combinations that defied expectation. He was unafraid to push the limits, to trust his intuition. I'd like you to do the same." Eva took the paints, feeling the slight weight of the tubes in her hands. Her father's legacy, Mrs. Caldwell's quiet encouragement, all of it was overwhelming, yet exhilarating. She set up her canvas on the easel, glancing back at Toby, who gave her a reassuring nod. Then, with Mrs. Caldwell watching from beside her, she dipped a brush into the paint and began to work, letting her hand follow an instinct that felt almost instinctual. The colors flowed more freely than they ever had before. Mrs. Caldwell's subtle guidance urged her to blend shades she'd never thought to mix, to apply layers and textures with bold strokes that felt new yet familiar. As she painted, memories began surfacing, small flashes of her father's face, his warm smile, and the faint scent of oil paint on his clothes. She could almost hear him whispering encouragement as her brush danced over the canvas. At one point, Mrs. Caldwell quietly said, "He used to paint landscapes to capture his dreams too. Your father believed art held a kind of magic, a way to touch memories and emotions hidden from us." Eva looked at her, surprised. Did he think that paintings could help people remember? "More than remember," Mrs. Caldwell replied. "He believed paintings were windows to forgotten places, connections to people we've lost but carry with us." In that moment, Eva felt something click within her, a deep resonance she had never fully understood before. Art wasn't just a talent she had inherited. It was a way to reach across time, to touch the memories and love she thought she had lost forever. After hours of painting, Eva stepped back, marveling at what she had created. It was the grand house she had painted countless times, yet now it looked alive, as if breathing with color and memory. Toby looked at the painting with wide eyes, and Mrs. Caldwell's soft smile reflected a quiet pride. "This is just the beginning, Eva," Mrs. Caldwell said gently. "We have a lot to uncover together." Eva nodded, a mixture of gratitude and excitement swelling within her. The studio, her father's legacy, Mrs. Caldwell's mentorship, all of it felt like a door opening to a world she was ready to explore. Eva's days took on a new rhythm, split between her responsibilities at the orphanage and her sessions with Mrs. Caldwell. Each visit to the studio felt like entering a different world, one that stirred memories she couldn't quite place, but that felt deeply significant. She would often arrive feeling anxious or weighed down by the orphanage's unchanging atmosphere and Toby's quiet, lingering illness. Yet, as soon as she picked up her brush and started painting, a strange calm would settle over her, like she was tapping into something greater than herself. But the memories that surfaced through her painting were complicated. Sometimes they offered comfort, like warm flashes of her father's face, or the sound of his voice encouraging her, urging her to look deeper, to see beyond what was visible. But other times, these memories brought unease, a feeling that something important had been lost, or worse, that it was taken from her. One afternoon, Eva was working on a painting of a grove of willow trees, a scene she recalled from a hazy dream that felt familiar yet just out of reach. She was experimenting with brushwork that Mrs. Caldwell had taught her, using loose, broad strokes to create a sense of motion in the branches. But as she layered the paint, a faint image began to emerge in her mind, of herself as a small child, hiding behind one of these trees, watching someone approach in the distance. She tried to focus on the memory, but it slipped away like a shadow, leaving her unsettled. Mrs. Caldwell noticed her hesitation. "Eva, you seem distracted. What's on your mind?" Eva hesitated, unsure of how to explain the feeling. It's hard to put into words," she admitted. "Sometimes when I paint, I see things, memories, I think, but they don't always make sense." Mrs. Caldwell gave her an understanding look. "Art can be like that. It's a language of the soul, Eva, and sometimes it speaks in fragments. Don't worry if it doesn't all come together at once. Just let it guide you." The encouragement helped, and Eva resumed her work. But the memory lingered at the edge of her mind, a reminder of something incomplete, like a puzzle missing vital pieces. And every time she looked at Toby, pale and wan as he sat quietly beside her, Eva felt the urgency of finding answers. She needed to know where they came from, what they had lost, and why it felt like Toby's health was somehow tied to a past neither of them could remember. As the weeks went by, Mrs. Caldwell continued to push Eva's artistic boundaries. She introduced her to new techniques that were challenging yet strangely intuitive. She taught Eva how to create depth by layering shades, how to use fine lines to bring out details, and how to blend colors to create emotions that couldn't be described in words. It was exhausting but exhilarating work, and Eva often found herself lost in it, the studio around her fading away as she painted scenes she couldn't explain, scenes that seemed to emerge from some hidden well within her. One day, Mrs. Caldwell presented her with a particularly difficult exercise. She had set up a still life arrangement of objects, a vase, an apple, a folded cloth, but she asked Eva to paint them as if they were part of a larger story, to imagine the objects' past and the emotions tied to them. Eva stared at the setup, feeling the weight of the challenge. It was more abstract than anything she had done, but she focused, trying to see beyond the objects and imagine them as part of a scene filled with meaning. Hours passed as she worked, and by the time she finished, she was both mentally and physically exhausted. Mrs. Caldwell examined her work with a satisfied nod, her eyes full of approval. "Well done, Eva. Your father would have been proud. He often painted this way, letting emotions shape the subject instead of confining himself to realism." The mention of her father filled Eva with a bittersweet sense of pride. She had never known him, yet here, in the strokes of paint and the depths of color, she felt a connection stronger than words. She glanced down at her paintbrush, and a flicker of memory surfaced, her father's hand guiding hers, teaching her the proper way to hold a brush. It was faint, almost a whisper, but it made her feel closer to him, as if he were still watching over her. One evening, while searching through the shelves in Mrs. Caldwell's studio for a fresh canvas, Eva came across an old wooden box tucked behind a row of books. Curious, she pulled it out and opened it, revealing a set of painting supplies. Among the brushes, one in particular caught her eye. It was worn, with a faded mahogany handle, and engraved with the initials TG. Eva's breath caught. "Mrs. Caldwell, is this?" Mrs. Caldwell turned, her face softening when she saw the brush. "Yes, Eva, that was your father's. He gave it to me before he passed as a token of our friendship. I've kept it here all these years, but I think it's time it returned to you." Trembling, Eva took the brush in her hands. The weight of it felt right, familiar, like a part of her father was being returned to her. She could almost feel his presence beside her, a comforting warmth that brought tears to her eyes. As she held the brush, more memories surfaced, fleeting images of her father smiling down at her, of his hands stained with paint, of a gentle voice telling her, "Art is a gift, Eva. It lets us hold on to things that time tries to take away." The memories were fleeting but powerful, and for the first time, Eva felt like she truly understood what art meant to her father and to herself. She wasn't just painting scenes from a dream. She was reaching into the past, holding on to the love and legacy her father had left behind. After that day, the brush became her most treasured possession, a piece of her father's legacy that guided her as she painted. She found herself pouring even more of her heart into her work, the scenes she created becoming richer and more vivid, as if each brushstroke was bringing her closer to the family she had lost. But with each memory, with each brushstroke, her worry for Toby grew. His health showed little improvement, and some days he was too weak to even leave his bed at the orphanage. She knew she had to keep pushing forward to uncover the truth, not just for herself, but for him. Her father's legacy was a gift, but it was also a responsibility, a path she had to follow to protect the only family she had left. One evening, as Eva lingered in Mrs. Caldwell's studio after a long session, Mrs. Caldwell invited her to sit by the fireplace in the cozy sitting room next to the studio. The fire crackled, casting warm shadows over the walls, and Eva felt a quiet sense of security as she sank into the chair beside Mrs. Caldwell. Toby had fallen asleep on the small couch, wrapped in a blanket, and looking more peaceful than she had seen him in days. For a moment, it was as if they were a real family, safe and whole. Mrs. Caldwell gazed at the fire, her expression distant, as though recalling something long buried. She was silent for a time, and Eva sensed that she was gathering her thoughts, maybe even struggling with whether to speak. Finally, Mrs. Caldwell sighed, her voice soft but steady. "Eva, there is something I've kept from you, a part of your past that I felt was too painful to share too soon, but I think you're ready now." Eva's heart began to race. She had often wondered about her family, about the hazy memories that came to her in her dreams, yet she had never been able to fully grasp the truth. She leaned forward, feeling both eager and anxious. Mrs. Caldwell continued, her voice tinged with sorrow. "Your father, Thomas, and we were very close. I was there the day he met your mother, Clara. She was beautiful, radiant, and he loved her with all his heart. Together, they created a life built around art and love. Their home was filled with music, laughter, and endless inspiration. They adored you and Toby. I remember how they would speak about the future they envisioned for both of you." Hearing this, Eva felt an ache grow in her chest, a longing for a life she had lost, for parents she could barely remember. She gripped the arm of her chair, steeling herself for what she sensed was coming. "One summer evening, they took you and Toby on a drive out to the countryside," Mrs. Caldwell continued, her gaze dropping to her hands. "It was a holiday, a small getaway, but on the way back, there was a terrible accident. A truck had lost control and collided with them." Her voice softened further, a tremor breaking through. "Your parents didn't survive." Eva's breath caught. She had suspected something tragic, had always felt the weight of loss without knowing why, but hearing the words, spoken so clearly and with such finality, struck her like a blow. Her parents were gone, truly gone. She was left only with fragments of memories, scattered like leaves in the wind, and a life that had been taken from her too soon. "But, Toby and how did we?" Eva's voice cracked, her throat tight with emotion. Mrs. Caldwell reached over, resting a comforting hand on Eva's. "Miraculously, you and Toby survived. Somehow, you had crawled out of the wreckage. A passerby found you both huddled together on the side of the road, clutching each other, dazed and crying. You were too young to understand what had happened, too traumatized to remember. You were taken in by the authorities and eventually sent to the orphanage, with no family left to claim you. I searched for you, Eva, but it took years to discover what had become of you. I only recently learned you were at Rosefield when I saw you at the art fair." The revelation filled Eva with a mix of sorrow and relief. Part of her was grateful to finally know the truth, to understand why she had always felt a hollow emptiness she couldn't explain. But another part of her, perhaps the deepest part, was devastated. The parents she had longed for, the family she had dreamed of, were gone forever, lost to a tragic moment she could never change. Tears filled her eyes, and she struggled to hold them back. "I feel like I failed them," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "They had all these dreams for us, for me, and here I am, unable to do anything but paint memories I barely remember." Mrs. Caldwell shook her head, her expression gentle. "Eva, your parents wouldn't see it that way. Art was at the heart of their lives, and that gift is something they passed on to you. Every time you paint, every time you bring life to a canvas, you are honoring them. But you don't have to be exactly like them to carry their legacy. Your journey is unique, and that's something they would have wanted for you." Eva's shoulders sagged under the weight of her conflicting emotions. She wanted to live up to her father's legacy, to create art that would make him proud, but at the same time, she felt overwhelmed. How could she ever be as talented as he was? How could she fulfill a dream that wasn't entirely her own? "But I'm scared," she admitted, her voice trembling. What if I'm not enough? What if I can't live up to what they wanted? Mrs. Caldwell reached out, cupping Eva's face with gentle hands. Eva, listen to me. Art isn't about perfection or living up to someone else's expectations. It's about expressing what's within you, sharing the world as you see it, and connecting with others through that expression. You don't have to be your father or your mother to be worthy. You only have to be yourself. The words sunk in slowly, like sunlight breaking through clouds. She had always thought of art as a way to preserve her memories, to hold on to the past, but now she saw it differently. Perhaps art was also a way to create new memories, to build a future that could honor her parents without chaining herself to their exact path. In the silence that followed, Eva took a deep breath, allowing herself to process everything. The pressure she had been feeling eased, replaced by a quieter resolve. She didn't have to be exactly like her father. She could paint her own story, even if it was interwoven with his. At that moment, Toby stirred on the couch, his eyes fluttering open. He looked around, confused, before his gaze settled on Eva. She reached out, squeezing his hand, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. Toby was part of her family too, and they had a future that was still unwritten. She would protect him, as she always had, but she would also embrace this legacy in her own way. Mrs. Caldwell spoke again, her voice gentle. Take your time, Eva. You don't have to decide everything now, but know that your parents' love lives in you, in every brushstroke, every choice you make. You're carrying them forward, whether you realize it or not. Eva nodded, wiping her eyes. She knew the journey ahead wouldn't be easy. She still felt the loss of her parents acutely, and the weight of their dreams lingered, but it no longer felt like a burden she had to carry alone. With Mrs. Caldwell's support, with Toby beside her, and with her own growing strength, she felt ready to continue. This wasn't just about preserving memories. It was about building something new, something her parents would have cherished, a life full of purpose, love, and the courage to forge her own path. The weeks leading up to the exhibition were intense. Eva poured herself into her art as she had never done before, her brushes sweeping across the canvas with newfound determination. Mrs. Caldwell had arranged for her paintings to be displayed in a local gallery, a well-known space where people from all over the town came to view and buy artwork. The idea was overwhelming. Eva had painted for years, but she'd never thought of herself as a true artist, let alone one worthy of a public gallery display. Every time she walked into Mrs. Caldwell's studio, Eva felt the pressure mounting. She could feel her father's presence with every brushstroke, a whisper from the past urging her to reach beyond herself. Sometimes it was exhilarating. Each new painting brought a sense of closeness to the parents she could barely remember. But other times, doubt crept in, twisting her thoughts until she questioned everything. What if her work wasn't good enough? What if she was only fooling herself, trying to live up to a legacy that didn't belong to her? On the day of the exhibition, Eva awoke early, her heart racing with nerves. She dressed carefully, choosing a simple dress that felt both respectful and fitting for the occasion. Toby, who had been watching her progress with quiet admiration, tried to reassure her as she fidgeted in front of the small mirror at the orphanage. "You're going to be amazing, Eva. Everyone's going to love your paintings." Eva forced a smile for his sake, but deep down she wasn't sure. "I hope you're right, Toby." He reached up, giving her a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "I know I am." The gallery was bustling by the time they arrived, the air humming with conversations and the quiet clinking of glasses. Eva felt her anxiety spike as she stepped into the warm, well-lit space, the walls adorned with her work. Familiar scenes of willow trees, sunlit meadows, and the mysterious house from her dreams greeted her like old friends, but seeing them displayed so publicly made her feel vulnerable. What if nobody understood them? What if they didn't see what she saw? Mrs. Caldwell found her, smiling warmly. "You've done beautifully, Eva. This is your night." Eva nodded, trying to steady herself, but her hands trembled slightly. She glanced at Toby, who stood beside her, beaming with pride despite his tired frame. His belief in her was like an anchor, steadying the storm within her. Slowly, people began to gather around her paintings. She heard murmurs of admiration, soft exclamations of wonder. A couple paused before the painting of the grand house, their expressions deep in thought. A young girl tugged at her father's arm, pointing to a canvas of wildflowers that seemed to move under an unseen breeze. One voice stood out, gentle and familiar. "It's like looking into a memory," the elderly woman said, stepping forward. It was the same woman who had first paused at Eva's stall at the art fair. Eva's heart leaped with recognition and hope. The woman met her gaze and smiled knowingly. "You have a gift, my dear, and tonight, you've shared it with all of us." As the night wore on, Eva felt a shift within her. The doubt hadn't disappeared entirely, but it had been joined by something stronger, a quiet confidence, a sense of belonging. She didn't have to be her father or live up to anyone else's expectations. She only had to paint, to let her heart guide her, and to know that in doing so, she was not just honoring the past, but also shaping her own future. Toby squeezed her hand, his eyes bright despite his weariness. "See, Eva? I told you. They love it, just like I do." Eva squeezed back, her smile real this time. "Yes, Toby, I think you were right." Mrs. Caldwell picked them up later that morning, and they rode together to the gallery. Eva's hands trembled in her lap as they drew closer, her stomach churning with anxiety. She had imagined this day so many times, but now that it was here, all she could feel was fear. Her paintings, her memories, her dreams were about to be displayed for everyone to see. What if they didn't understand? Worse, what if they judged her, saw only flaws and amateurism in the brushstrokes she had poured her heart into? The gallery was already bustling with people when they arrived. The walls lined with her paintings, each one framed and lit as if they were priceless treasures. Eva's breath caught as she stepped inside. Seeing her work on display felt surreal, like stepping into a dream she hadn't dared to believe could come true. The scenes she had painted, the willow grove, the grand house surrounded by wildflowers, the forest clearing where she remembered her father's voice, were laid out for the world to see, fragments of her life now exposed to strangers' eyes. But the sight of them all together also left her feeling incredibly vulnerable. She felt as if she were standing in front of everyone without armor, open and raw. She spotted Mrs. Caldwell speaking to a small group nearby, her voice warm as she introduced them to Eva's work. Some faces were filled with curiosity, others with quiet admiration. Yet despite their positive expressions, Eva's doubts grew louder. The magnitude of her father's legacy weighed on her, and she could almost hear a voice in the back of her mind whispering, "You're not ready. You'll never live up to what he was." Just as the first few visitors approached her paintings, Eva found herself stepping back, her hands shaking as she clutched at her dress. She could feel panic rising within her, a consuming urge to flee. She didn't belong here. She was only pretending, trying to fill a role she couldn't possibly measure up to. Her father had been a brilliant artist, but she was just a girl from an orphanage, desperately clinging to memories she didn't fully understand. Mrs. Caldwell noticed her retreat and came over, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Eva, what's wrong?" Eva shook her head, her voice a whisper. I don't think I can do this. What if they hate it? What if I'm not good enough? Maybe I should take them down before it's too late." Mrs. Caldwell squeezed her shoulder, her expression full of compassion. "Eva, every artist has those fears. But remember why you're here. You're sharing something beautiful, something deeply personal. Art is never about being good enough. It's about reaching out and connecting with others. Your father would be so proud of you right now, not because of technical skill, but because you're brave enough to let the world see a piece of who you are." The words sank in, slowly dissolving the tension in her chest. Eva took a deep breath, focusing on Mrs. Caldwell's warm gaze. She looked around the gallery, seeing her paintings anew, remembering the hours she had spent with each one, lost in the memories they evoked. They weren't just art, they were her story, her family's story, the only way she had to keep them alive. With renewed courage, Eva nodded. "Thank you, Mrs. Caldwell. I'll stay." As the evening went on, people stopped to admire her work, asking questions about her inspirations, complimenting the emotions each painting seemed to evoke. Eva felt herself relaxing, realizing that each viewer took something different from her work, yet every reaction felt genuine. She saw her past come alive through their eyes and felt, for the first time, like she was truly honoring her family's legacy, not by living up to it, but by sharing it, piece by piece, as her own. By the time they left that night, Eva's heart was filled with quiet pride. Her paintings had found a place in the world, and she felt ready to follow wherever this journey led her next, no longer burdened by the past, but inspired by it. For the rest of the afternoon, she drifted around the gallery, listening to people's reactions, answering questions, and observing as her work touched those who viewed it. Some visitors asked about her process, others about her inspiration, but most simply admired the scenes of quiet beauty she had created. They saw the landscapes of a distant dream, a life beyond the bounds of everyday experience, and many remarked on the depth of emotion in each piece. A young woman approached one of the paintings, a forest scene with rays of light streaming through the trees, and her eyes filled with tears. She looked at Eva, her voice choked with emotion. It reminds me of my childhood, of a place my family used to visit. Thank you for capturing something so beautiful. For a moment, Eva felt the familiar ache of loss, but also a sense of warmth and fulfillment. She hadn't just painted for herself or her father's memory. She had created something that spoke to others, that connected her experiences to theirs. This realization filled her with a sense of belonging that she hadn't felt in a long time. As the exhibition drew to a close, Mrs. Caldwell approached her with a gentle smile. "Eva, I have good news. Several people have expressed interest in buying your paintings. You've done something incredible here." Eva felt a rush of joy and disbelief. Selling her paintings meant more than just recognition. It meant she could finally provide Toby with the care he needed. Her art had the power not only to honor her family's memory, but also to build a future for herself and her brother. As she looked around the gallery one last time, Eva felt a sense of peace settle over her. She had faced her fears, dared to share her deepest emotions with the world, and in doing so, she had honored her father's legacy in a way that was uniquely hers. The paintings were still her memories, her dreams, but now they were more than that. They had become gifts, connections to others, and markers of her own strength. When they finally left the gallery, Toby walked beside her, his small hand in hers. "See? I told you everyone would love your work," he said with a proud smile. Eva laughed, squeezing his hand. "Thank you, Toby. I couldn't have done it without you." As they walked into the night, Eva felt a renewed sense of purpose. She hadn't just shared her father's legacy. She had made it her own, blending the past and the present and creating something new. With Toby by her side and Mrs. Caldwell's mentorship guiding her, she felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. In the days following the exhibition, Eva felt as if she were floating in a dream. News of her painting's success spread quickly through the town. Several art critics praised her work in the local paper, commending her captivating technique and deep emotional resonance, while others marveled at the maturity in her brushstrokes, so rare for someone her age. But for Eva, the most profound satisfaction came from the knowledge that her paintings had touched people, that they had connected her memories to others in ways she hadn't thought possible. More practically, the exhibition's success allowed her to sell enough pieces to cover the costs of Toby's treatment. Each time a painting was sold, Mrs. Caldwell handed her the earnings with a proud smile, watching as Eva tucked away the money with a look of determination. Soon, Eva had collected enough to arrange for the medical care Toby needed, and the relief she felt was immeasurable. She could finally ensure that her brother would get better, that he wouldn't have to suffer in silence any longer. The paintings, her father's legacy, had given her the means to secure their future. One afternoon, as Eva was finishing up a new painting in Mrs. Caldwell's studio, Mrs. Caldwell entered, carrying a small, slender box wrapped in faded blue fabric. She approached Eva with a soft smile and an unmistakable glimmer of excitement in her eyes. "Eva, she began, her voice gentle. I've been thinking about this for some time now, and I believe the moment has come. She placed the box in Eva's hands, her eyes filling with pride and something deeper, perhaps even nostalgia. Eva looked down at the box, her fingers tracing the worn edges of the fabric as anticipation filled her. She glanced up at Mrs. Caldwell, whose face softened with a look of quiet encouragement. Slowly, Eva untied the fabric and lifted the lid, revealing a beautifully crafted, leather-bound sketchbook. The cover was engraved with initials that made her heart skip. TG? It was your father's, Mrs. Caldwell said softly. Thomas kept this sketchbook with him everywhere. His early ideas, inspirations, even Eva looked at the box, curious but hesitant. She untied the fabric and opened it carefully. Inside, lying on a bed of soft velvet, was a beautifully aged paintbrush. Its handle was worn smooth from years of use, and engraved on the side were the initials TG. It was her father's brush, the very same one she had once discovered hidden among Mrs. Caldwell's supplies. But now, seeing it presented to her with such reverence, Eva felt a profound sense of awe. This was your father's favorite brush, Mrs. Caldwell said, her voice soft. He used it for many of his greatest works. When he passed, he left it with me, and I kept it safe, hoping that one day I would find you and give it back. I believe it belongs with you now. Eva's hands shook slightly as she lifted the brush, feeling its weight, its smooth, familiar texture. She could almost sense her father's presence, as if he were standing beside her, guiding her hands as he had done in those early half-remembered days. Her chest tightened, and she blinked back tears. This simple, worn brush was more than just a tool. It was a piece of her father, a tangible connection to the love and creativity that had defined his life. Thank you, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. I don't know how to repay you for everything you've done for me and Toby. I feel like I have a part of him with me again. Mrs. Caldwell's expression softened. You don't owe me anything, Eva. I wanted to help because I knew your father, yes, but also because I see something extraordinary in you. Your art, your passion, it's not only a continuation of his legacy, it's a legacy of your own. You've found a way to honor him, but you've also found your own voice. Eva held the brush tightly, a sense of warmth and strength filling her. She realized that this journey wasn't just about preserving her father's memory. It was about stepping forward with her own story, her own vision, woven together with his. With Toby by her side, her mentor's unwavering support, and her father's memory guiding her, she felt a newfound determination. From that moment on, Eva knew that her art wasn't just a way to remember, but a way to forge ahead, building a future from the foundation her father had laid. She would continue to create, to inspire, and to carry her family's legacy forward. But she would do so with her own voice, one that had been growing stronger with each brushstroke, waiting for this very moment to truly be heard. The words settled over Eva like a warm blanket, filling her with both pride and peace. She had spent so long wondering if she could ever live up to her father's reputation, but now she realized that she didn't have to be exactly like him to carry his legacy forward. Her art was different, yet it was rooted in the same love, the same curiosity, and the same drive to create. Eva glanced down at the brush, holding it delicately as if it were a precious relic. I'll take care of it, just like he would have, she promised. I want to keep creating, to build something that would make him proud, and I want to show Toby that we come from something beautiful. Mrs. Caldwell nodded, her eyes bright. You already have, Eva. Every painting you've made has been a testament to that beauty. With renewed resolve, Eva turned back to her canvas, her father's brush in hand. She began to paint with a clarity and confidence she hadn't felt before, each stroke bold and purposeful. There was no hesitation, no fear, only the joy of creation and the sense that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Days turned into weeks, and Eva's work blossomed. Mrs. Caldwell continued to guide her, offering advice and encouragement, but more and more, Eva found her own rhythm, her own style. She painted not only the memories of her past, but also scenes from her imagination, places and stories that were entirely her own. Toby's health began to improve as well, thanks to the treatments the exhibition's success had afforded them. He regained his strength little by little, his cheeks flushing with color, and his laughter returning to fill the quiet corners of their days. Every time he watched Eva paint, he'd offer a small smile, as if silently thanking her for the future she had fought to give him. One evening, after completing a particularly challenging piece, Eva sat back, wiping her hands on a cloth and gazing at her work. She felt a profound sense of accomplishment, not just for this painting, but for the journey she had undertaken, the courage it had taken to get here. She had faced her fears, honored her family, and carved out her own path. She was no longer just a girl from an orphanage with a few vague memories and a paintbrush. She was an artist, a protector, and a bearer of both her father's legacy and her own. As she carefully cleaned her father's brush, she felt a deep, quiet satisfaction. She had found her way to him, to the parents she had lost, and in doing so had found herself. Her art was no longer just a way to hold on to the past. It had become the foundation of a future she was ready to build, one filled with love, resilience, and the courage to create beauty in the world. The success of the gallery showing had given Eva more than financial stability. It had instilled in her a renewed sense of purpose. With Toby's health improving daily and the knowledge that she could provide for both of them through her art, Eva felt a strength she hadn't known before. Painting had once been a way to cling to her parents' memory, to hold on to the past she could barely remember, but now it was so much more. Her art was a bridge between what she had lost and what she could build, a path that she chose not out of obligation, but out of genuine love. With Mrs. Caldwell's encouragement, Eva began to develop her own unique style, blending the landscapes and memories of her childhood with her own visions, ideas that came purely from within her. She found herself experimenting with color and form, pushing her skills to capture emotions she couldn't put into words. Each painting felt like a step forward, a journey that was as much about self-discovery as it was about her father's legacy. Her art wasn't simply an homage to her parents. It was a testament to her resilience, to her ability to transform grief into something beautiful. Every day after school, she would work in Mrs. Caldwell's studio, her father's brush a comforting weight in her hand. It reminded her of the connection she now carried with her, a gentle encouragement to keep going, to honor where she came from while creating something distinctly her own. The memories of her parents no longer haunted her. Instead, they inspired her, encouraging her to be brave, to share her voice with the world. For Toby, Eva's success meant stability and hope. He had always believed in her, but now, watching her with a sense of pride, he saw the future they could build together. Eva had ensured that they were no longer simply surviving. They were living, thriving, shaping a life with the freedom to dream. She made him promise to tell her if he ever needed anything, and she knew that she could keep him safe, give him the life their parents had wanted for them. As she packed up a completed painting one evening, Eva felt a quiet, confident resolve settle within her. She was no longer just a girl in search of her past. She was an artist with a future of her own making, a future where she would carry her family's love and resilience with her, transforming it into something lasting, something beautiful. She had found her path, and with Toby by her side, she was ready to follow it wherever it would lead. In the quiet months following the gallery's success, a subtle shift took root within Eva. She had finally reached a place where her family's legacy empowered rather than burdened her. Each day she spent painting, every brushstroke she laid down, was a testament not only to her parents' memory, but to her own growth and resilience. Her art had transformed from something purely nostalgic into a celebration of life, both past and present. The weight of living up to her father's legacy had melted away, replaced by a deep understanding that she could honor him while embracing her own unique vision. Eva realized that the things her parents had left behind, the fragments of memory, the inherited brush, and the love for creating beauty, were gifts, not constraints. They were threads that connected her to a story larger than herself, yet left plenty of room for her to weave her own dreams into that tapestry. She felt renewed, grounded in the knowledge that she could stand on her father's shoulders without losing her own identity. It was freeing, like stepping into sunlight after a long winter, and it gave her confidence in her work, her decisions, and her vision for the future. And through it all, Toby's health continued to improve. The treatments she had been able to secure with the gallery's earnings were taking effect, and day by day, his strength returned. Color bloomed back into his cheeks, and his once frequent fevers faded into distant memories. Watching him regain his vitality filled Eva with immense relief and pride. She had achieved something precious. Not only had she found her calling, but she had safeguarded her brother's well-being, fulfilling the promise she had made to protect him, no matter what. Toby, too, sensed the change in his sister. He would often sit beside her while she painted, sharing his thoughts and laughter with a brightness that hadn't been there before. He no longer looked frail or worried, but rather proud and secure, knowing that they had built something lasting together. Their bond, already strong, had grown unbreakable, forged through shared struggles and triumphs. With each new day, they found more reasons to laugh, to dream, and to plan their future together. One evening, as Eva put the finishing touches on a new piece, Toby watched her in admiration, his voice quiet but sure. "You know, Eva, I think Mom and Dad would be really proud of you." She turned to him, a smile spreading across her face. "Thank you, Toby. But you know what? I think they'd be proud of us, of everything we've done together." They sat together in comfortable silence, a sense of peace enveloping them. Eva no longer felt like a lost girl searching for answers in the shadows of her past. She had stepped into her own light as an artist, a protector, and a sister. And for the first time, she felt truly whole, knowing that her family's legacy had given her roots, but her own choices had given her wings. In the months that followed, Eva's life blossomed into something she had once only dreamed of. With Mrs. Caldwell's continued mentorship, she dedicated herself to refining her skills and exploring her own unique style. The studio, once a place of mystery and uncertainty, now felt like home, filled with laughter, experimentation, and the warm smell of oil paint. Each brush stroke she laid down carried both her past and her future, blending her family's legacy with her personal vision. Her confidence grew, and with it, a profound sense of purpose. Eva's work took on a life of its own. Her paintings began to gain attention beyond the town, with collectors expressing interest in her vivid, emotional landscapes and dreamlike scenes. She felt as if her parents were with her in spirit, guiding her, but giving her the freedom to shape her own path. The legacy she once viewed as a weight had transformed into a foundation, one that gave her the courage to push her boundaries, to innovate, and to create without fear. At home, Toby continued to grow stronger, his laughter a constant source of joy for Eva. They made plans together, talked about dreams and goals, and shared the simple pleasures of their new life. With each day, Eva felt the unbreakable bond of family, a connection that would carry them forward into whatever future they chose. As Eva stood before a blank canvas one morning, she felt a powerful sense of belonging. She was both a daughter honoring her heritage and an artist forging her own path. And with each new painting, she breathed life into that legacy, creating something beautiful and lasting that would endure long after she was gone.